A locked-up woman asked for her son to be taken away before it was too late. This is what was happening. A locked-up woman asks for her son to be taken away before it is too late. When the police arrived, they could not believe their eyes. Rick was 28 years old, and every morning he saw Luz passing by the school. At the time, she was 16, and he was starting to become obsessed. No longer just watching her walk by, but hanging around her house every day and following her everywhere. He knew so many things about them that it was really creepy for someone who hadn't even said hello to her yet in her whole life. And meanwhile, Luz was living quietly, with no idea that someone had become obsessed with her to unsuspected levels. It was only a matter of time before he tried to approach her, and when he finally did, Luz rejected him. He had tried so hard to talk to her that she was scared, and even though she had found him handsome, she knew immediately that she was in danger being near him. But in reality, she had never imagined that she would be able to do what she did to him, and that because of him, her life would change completely. And the fact is that from the moment she had rejected him, he began to plan a way to make her own. So, a few weeks after she met him, Luz noticed that he began to approach her in his car when she was walking to school, and even though she sped up her pace, he did not stop following her. Until at one point, without her having time to react, just when there was nothing nearby to help him, he got out of the car and in a second, he gagged and immobilized her and took her away. Luz did not arrive at school, nor did she return home that day, nor the following days. She had suddenly vanished, and there was no news of her. Her parents were desperate, and the whole neighborhood had activated the alarms for Luz. They searched for her for weeks without success, and as time went by, they lost hope of finding her alive. And when it was not weeks, but months, the authorities' search began to lose intensity. A year later, only her parents remembered their missing daughter and were still searching for her without help. In the meantime, Luz was locked up, and Rick had finally achieved his goal. He had her at his complete mercy and forced her to be with him. A year later, a child would be born from those fateful encounters. But despite the circumstances, Luz loved the baby from the first moment and swore she would get him out of there someday. While the opportunity came, Luz did her best to make her son grow as normal as possible, although in a 3x3 room, that was impossible. However, the baby grew up knowing that there was something beyond those four walls, and that one day he would know it. She told him about his grandparents and never tired of telling him how much she loved him. While she tried to protect him from the environment in which they lived and hid him every time Rick came in, she wanted him to have minimum contact with that monster that was his father, but that he would never resemble. When his son was already 3 years old, the first hope of freedom arrived, albeit distant. Rick had entered the room with his toolkit to fix the bathroom that had been flooded for weeks, and that had made the little one sick, and that was how Luz took advantage of an oversight to hide a file under the bed. With it, she hoped to weaken the bars of the window until she could finally break them down, but she never imagined it would take her so long. It had already been 6 months, and they had only made it halfway through. Her hands were shredded, but it cheered her up every day at the thought of freedom. She didn't care about spending the rest of her life or even dying trying. All she wanted was to be able to ask for help for her child and to get him out of there. And so, after a year of hard work, she finally succeeded. She removed the bars one by one with her heart racing. She knew that Rick didn't hear anything from outside, and she only hoped that he wouldn't think of entering at that moment. As best she could, she threw one of the bars into the street, trying to attract attention. Luckily, no one had been hit in the fall, but some policemen who were nearby immediately began to look for the perpetrator of that recklessness that could have left someone injured. When they looked up to the top of the building, they found a woman waving exaggeratedly at a window, asking for help and crying. At one point, she lifted her son in her arms and showed him through the window, getting him taken away. She didn't even expect to get out of there. All she wanted was for her son to be rescued from the ordeal. As the woman seemed frightened and did not scream, the policemen debated whether she was asking for help or threatening to throw her son. When in doubt, they decided to ask the fire department for help so that they could get to the window and understand what was happening and why the woman had thrown that bar from that height. The room in which Lucy and her son had been locked in was a small room, which until that day had bars on the window and had been completely soundproofed. It was on a very high floor from where no one could see what was inside, and the neighbors had no idea that anyone but that strange and lonely Rick lived in that apartment. When the policemen arrived there with the help of the fire department, they immediately understood that they were dealing with a case of painful captivity, and that they had done the right thing by listening to the woman who told them to get there through the windows. They could make it through the main entrance. They had met Rick on the other side, who still didn't know what was going on inside. When he heard the knocking on the door, he simply thought it was Luce asking for food, or something else, or just making her daily attempt to get him to let them out, but he never imagined the scene he would find. The instant he entered, 2 policemen immediately immobilized him and captured him, not without first forcing him to kneel before Luce and her son to ask for forgiveness, although only seeing him pay for many years in jail would make her feel that the debt was settled, although she could never forgive him for making her son spend the first 4 years of his life locked up, unable to enjoy a normal childhood. The trial, in which everyone knew the story of Luce and her son, was extremely painful. The jury and the entire public were appalled and did not hesitate to demand the full weight of the law for Rick. For weeks, Luce was harassed by journalists who wanted to talk to her and know her story in depth, until she could no longer relive those traumatic events so many times. It was more than she could bear. Rick was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a sentence that many felt was insufficient because he did not serve it in its entirety. After 10 years in prison, he woke up one day murdered in his cell, and it was not known who had been the perpetrators of his death. For Luce, who expected him to die an old man in prison, it was not the best news, but at the same time, she was relieved to know that he was no longer in this world, with being as dismal as he was. The whole process for Luce and her son was traumatic. The 5 years she had spent locked up had upset her to the point that she needed a long time of psychological therapy before she felt like a normal human being again. But she struggled every day for her son, who was spending most of his time with his grandparents, but who missed the mom who played with him, who loved him, and who would go to great lengths to distract him from the fact that they were locked up. She certainly would have given her life for him. It was after a year that mother and son were finally able to reunite full-time and move in together. For both of them, it would be a new discovery of life, and Luce knew she was going to be happy, but they were free together, and that was all that mattered to her. Mother and son were very close until the last of their days, and finally managed to leave their painful history behind, keeping only the good moments they built throughout their whole life when they could finally be happy and at peace. Hey, if you liked this story, like it, share it with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'm Max, and see you in the next story.